It's great to welcome Matt Parratt, who works as a research biologist at Forest Research at the Northern Field Station near Edinburgh. He's a keen fell runner and provides training in tree ID for Field Studies Council. And he's a BSBI joint referee for conifers. And Matt is going to tell us about larches in the British Isles, the history, ecology, and identification. So over to you, Matt.
Right, good afternoon, everyone. I've got the last slot of the day. So I'm going to talk about conifers for a change, specifically the larches. So hopefully, what am I going to talk about today? Well, first I'm going to look at what is a larch, what makes a larch a larch. We'll look briefly at the taxa that you're going to commonly see out and about. Now, there are plenty of others in collections and gardens, but really there are just a few that you're going to come across. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why we grow them. We heard earlier from Flora about another Phytophthora, another plant killer. I'll speak briefly about Phytophthora ramorum, and then we'll get on to them a little bit really, which is the identification of the taxa that you're going to be seeing. If I could just ask if you put any questions you've got into the chat. It's quite easy to sort of lose questions before we get to the end, so pop them in the chat and then Jim will shuffle through them when we get to the end. Okay, so firstly, what makes a larch a larch? So they're conifers for a start, and they're members of the pine family or Pinnaceae. So we've got a compound cone, and what that means is the cone is comprised of two parts. You've got a stiff woody scale and then a thin papery bract which sits paired with the scale. Now, sometimes those are visible, sometimes they're not visible. And there are two seeds per cone scaler, and really those two characters tell you you're in the Pinnaceae, which is, as I said, the pine family. Now, those seeds have a wing, which is non-detachable unless you use some brute force. And that compares with the pines, which have a very easily detachable wing. You just need to really brush it gently and that wing will detach. So in the larches, those are firmly attached. Now, this is the seed of Larix gemellii, not one of the ones we're going to find that often here, but unfortunately I didn't have a picture, so yeah, they have an integral wing. Foliage. So we have single needles on the long shoots, as we can see in the image on the right there, and sometimes they can be quite big, especially on a rapidly growing lead shoot. And then we have clusters of needles, more than 10 a cluster, and they're on short shoots. Now, if you use stace, the word short shoot and long shoot can be misleading. Short shoots here are essentially spur shoots, a bit like you would get on a rowan tree or on apple trees. So they're very, very dwarf. So in fact, these aren't really clusters. These are still spiraling, but they have the appearance of being a little cluster or a little tuft. Now, the needles are flattened and they're dorsiventrally, so essentially top to bottom flattened rather than side to side, and they're soft. Now, that last character really distinguishes them very quickly from cedars, which share the long shoots, single needles on long shoots and clustered needles on short shoots. The biggie really is that they're deciduous. Now, there are 4 other deciduous conifer genera. None of those you're really going to see very often, except possibly Metasequoia glyptostroboides, the dawn redwood. Now, that is popping up in towns and things, but the foliage is quite different and it's more feather-like in comparison. Larch species and distribution. There's a very fine picture here of the flowering cones of Larix potninii violaica. Some of these larches have very impressive flowers, in inverted commas, sometimes known as larch roses. There are 10 to 12 species, and that again depends on whose taxonomy you follow, as we just heard the comment made in the Polypody talk. But we're going to stick with 10. Now, their distribution is circumboreal. They encircle the globe really around the northern hemisphere. There are none in the southern hemisphere. Big centres of populations really are over in North America and in Asia. Now, there's a small isolated block of larches which sit over the Alps and the other mountains of Central Europe, and that's where Larix decidua comes from, the European larch. And 3 taxa are commonly found in the British Isles, and as I said earlier, you will get some in gardens and collections. Larix laricinea, tamarack occasionally pops up, but essentially it's the 3 taxa I'm going to talk about today that you're going to come across time and time again. The reproduction. So we've got this fabulous larch flower here. I'm going to use flower. I know it's not technically correct, but we've also got the male cones. So larches are monoecious. You get male and female on the same tree. But there are separate male and female cones. So the very brightly coloured cerise pink cone there is the female cone, and the little bobbly yellow ones are the male cones. Now, they are not persistent. Once the pollen is shed early in the year, they will disappear, not to be seen again. And these both appear in early spring, February stroke March, around about then. You might get a few outliers in January, but by March they're in full flow, and they're quite easily visible. They're not all the same colour. I should point out some of them will be pale, creamy coloured with violety edges to some of those little scaly bits. And some will be green. Some will be this kind of fine cerise pink colour. What we're seeing there on that female cone are actually the bracts, not the final scales. So just keep an eye on those bracts as we progress through the cone ripening phase. It's important to note as well that these, like most other conifers, are wind pollinated. So as pollination occurs, we start to get the cone developing that we're perhaps a bit more familiar with. The cone scales grow out and the bracts gradually become hidden. Now, sometimes you get a bit of resin on the cones, but not that common really. And finally, the cone ripens. Now, this all happens within 1 year. So these are relatively fast-growing cones. And if you look closely at that cone, you can see the bracts have completely disappeared. And the scales are what we're now seeing. Importantly, the cones are retained in situ on the twigs for several years. And quite often you will be able to see these very easily from the ground looking up into the canopy as these little dark blobs arrayed along the branches. We don't have, well, I'm going to just step back from that. We have 2 non-native larches and one which I'm going to say is native. You might say it's a neo-native. So how did they get here in the first place? European larch is a near neighbour relatively, and this is confined to the mountains of Central Europe, so the Alps. Essentially, it does extend into northern Italy a little way, Carpathians, but also there are a few little isolated populations in Poland up to the north. Now, this means that it is used to a relatively low rainfall, a very seasonal climate, so cold, snowy winters, warm, dry summers. It was introduced in 1620-ish, which makes it one of the first non-native trees which was introduced to the British Isles. There we go. It's mountains of Central Europe, about 1,000 to 2,000 meters-ish. And normally this forms the upper part of the tree line where it's present. It's a fairly typical stand of Larch decidua in northern Italy, courtesy of my colleague Bill Mason. Now, the vegetation under this is as a result of grazing by cattle. So you've got this short grassy sward underneath, but larch lets a lot of light through compared to a lot of other conifers. So you usually get a good ground layer beneath it. So we've had these trees in the British Isles for a long time. The oldest is at Cayley Gardens in Peeblesshire, in fact, just around the corner from where I live. It's about 296 years old and was allegedly planted by Sir James Nasmyth of Posso whilst visiting his friend, the Laird of Cayley. There's a little plaque next to the tree, so if you want to go and look at it, it's highly recommended at Cayley Gardens. Now, this branching structure is fairly typical of older trees where you get branches sweeping back upwards and forming a secondary leader, really. The tallest tree is also in Scotland. That's 48 metres at Reelig in Glenmoniac in the Highlands. There is a taller tree in Germany, upwards of 50 metres. So really the trees are reaching a very similar height to what they would in their native habitat here. The second non-native species we have is Japanese larch, or Larix camphori. Now, this arrived a lot later. It's native to Honshu in Japan only, that's it. Again, it's a montane species, and it's used to very cold, snowy winters, abundant rain and cool summers, and is generally more tolerant of wetter conditions than European larch, and consequently does better in the British Isles. This was introduced in 1861 by John Gould Veitch, who is one of the great plant hunters and was responsible for an awful lot of introductions. Another big plus of this tree is that it's canker resistant, as opposed to the European larch. So from a timber perspective, that's a very useful thing to have. The tallest tree, again, I'm afraid, is in Scotland. And this is about 45 metres at Blair Castle in Blair Athol, Perth and Kinross. Just remember that name, Athol. It's pretty tightly associated with larch in the British Isles. Now we come to the Dunkeld larch. Now, I'm not calling it hybrid larch because there are lots of other hybrid larches. Dunkeld larch gets used in a lot of publications, so that's the one I'm going to stick with. Larix marsh-lindsayii has a great name. It's had many during its short lifespan so far. So back in 1885, Larix camphori was planted near Larix decidua at Dunkeld House in Perthshire. And the seedlings were gathered up from around those parent trees in around 1897 and planted at Dunkeld. And it was pretty quickly noticed that these were different from the parents. One thing, they grew an awful lot faster. So they had heterosis or hybrid vigor. They really did outperform both parents vastly. So like I say, I'm slightly cheekily calling this a native, but near-native might be a better word. So we do have 4 native conifers in the British Isles, if we include that one. So what about the distributions? Now, thanks to the good old BSBI DDB, we can have a look at these distributions and see they are pretty much countrywide throughout England, through Wales, Scotland, and over on the island of Ireland as well. European larch is probably the most widely reported there. Jap larch, a bit less so, and it's, if anything, it's got a slightly western distribution, which isn't surprising given its preferences for wetter habitat. And the Dunkeld larch is scattered throughout as well. I'm not entirely convinced about those distributions, and for reasons I'll go into later, I suspect the Dunkeld larch is actually much more widely scattered than either of the parents. So the big reason really for larch being so widespread is down to forestry, and this is in no small part due to this chap here, fine-looking gentleman who is James Murray, the second Duke of Athol, who was around between 1690 and 1764. Now, his family are up in Perthshire, that's where their seat is, and particularly at Blair Athol and down at Dunkeld as well. And they have this moniker of being the planting dukes. And there's a really big reason for that. I mean, all of those plantings I've spoken about with Larix decidua in this country, and also the Japanese larch, Larix camphori, were down to this family and very much this guy here, James Murray. So he first planted Larix decidua from the Tyrol up around Blair Castle in 1738. So quite soon after the introduction into the British Isles. And very quickly, him and his descendants planted around 4,000 hectares of larch in Perthshire throughout the 18th century. You could make a very strong case for this being the birth of modern plantation forestry in the British Isles. So this family had a really big input into that. And we'll just have a look at the importance of larch. So these are some figures from 2014. So this was the most recent release. And the bars you see in the numbers are thousands of hectares. So no surprise, throughout the whole of Great Britain, I'm sorry, Ireland, you aren't included in these figures, neither is Northern Ireland, but 665,000 hectares of Sitka spruce, followed by 218,000 hectares of Scots pine. And I should point out, this is stocked woodland. These are managed woodlands that have been planted. This doesn't include trees scattered in the wider environment. But look at the third most widely planted species, larches. So that's all three taxa lumped in together. But that gives us some idea of the area that this species, this group of species covers. So Flora gave us a fantastic talk earlier about one of these Phytophthora species, one of these plant killers, and she did mention Phytophthora ramorum. Now, this was first identified on Larch in the southwest of England way back in 2009, but it's confirmed in 2010. And looking at this photo here, we've got this area of trees in the center of the image. And the bright green ones are healthy larch. All those brown ones are dead larch killed by Phytophthora ramorum. And this really has spread remarkably quickly. Now, unlike the Phytophthora Flora was talking about, this is also airborne. So hence it can spread a lot faster and is a lot more difficult to control. So the map here gives you an idea of the spreads. The latest squares there to have been identified are in red. So those are the most recent new infections. The lightest blue down in the southwest of England were the ones first identified in 2010/11. So this pathogen is now present in pretty much every area where larch is grown in the British Isles. And the finding of this triggered a massive effort. So we've got some control zones there in orange. And we've now got a situation where around 25% of the total area of larch was infected in 2019. And as you'll see from the map, we've had more infections confirmed since then. So this pathogen is spreading, and it's going to continue spreading as well. Now, it can infect other conifers as well as things like rhododendron. But on the other conifers, it's what's known as a terminal host. So the infection can't then jump on in its airborne form from those other species. So things like noble fir, western hemlock. We've also seen it on monkey puzzle very recently. So it's capable of infecting a lot of trees, but it can't then jump onto others from those. So what are the symptoms? What do you need to be looking out for? So dead trees are a good one, but it starts with lesions. So remember, this is an airborne pathogen, and we get these very resinous looking bark lesions. The resin there is quite clear, but it will turn white after a while. Now, these lesions gradually grow, and eventually they'll girdle the stems and kill those branches. Now, this is only going to go one way for this tree, and eventually we've got whole tree death quite rapidly. And you will now have seen things like sanitation felling to try and minimize the inoculum, so that's the airborne spore load, from infecting other species as well. Flora also mentioned shutting down routes of infection, and forestry commissions in the 3 nations have got this campaign of keep it clean. And I'd just like to reinforce how important it is to clean your boots between sites. So even if you're going from one site to another on the same sort of area, really, in the space of a day, dip your boots in a puddle or wash them in a stream or something. But if you're going home, clean them before you go home. Carry some disinfectant spray with you, or at the very least some water and a sturdy brush, or a hoof pick. Hoof picks are great for getting mud and gunk out of your boots. So this isn't just about the Phytophthora that affects juniper. It's not just about this Phytophthora. It's about unknown pathogens as well. So if we try and minimize our part in this, we'll be doing a good thing. So all of that Phytophthora has flooded the market for timber with larch, which, you know, it's a shame for timber prices, but it's a good thing if you want to use larch. So what do we use it for? Well, most of us are familiar with larch lap fencing. We see a lot of pallets and also wood packaging. It's also used for biomass as well. It does grow incredibly fast, and there's a lot of volume in there that burns quite well. Slightly more kind of marginal things like biorefining and chemical extracts. If we've got any violinists or cellists in the audience today, you'll be using something called rosin, and an extract from larch goes into that. We've also got Venice turpentine, which is used in the arts, and hoof care. Now, I'm not sure what it's used for in hoof care. I need to find out. And a horrendous sounding molecule called arabinogalactin, which is, you know, so widely used in foods, in animal feed, cosmetics, and medicine. And this idea of biorefining is probably going to get more widespread. The Finns are really pushing this. So a few sort of more picturesque uses on boat building. Now, there's a little boat builder up on the west coast of Scotland, Isle of Yew Boats. Alistair Grant very kindly allowed me to use these images. So larch is very resistant to rotting, and when it's the right quality, it is a superb boat building material. And as we can see in this little craft made by Alistair here, it's also seeing a bit of a resurgence as a cladding material. Now, a lot of this, like this folk museum up in Newton Moor, is Siberian larch, Larix sibirica, also sometimes combined with locally grown larch, but places like Great Glen House at Nature Scott was largely clad with locally grown larch. So there are some really good local uses for this. But what you'll really want to know is which one is which, and how do we tell the difference between them? So there are 2 characters you really need to focus on. You can pretty much ignore the rest, and you can even ignore the shoots to some extent, because it really does come down to the cones. They are the most stable feature which you can look at. The others all show some degree of variability. Now, that could be natural variation within the species, but I suspect what we could be seeing is actually a lot of hybrid out there in the wider population, which is being recorded as either of the 2 species rather than hybrid. So let's look at European larch first. So the cones have it. I did try and remember the quote from the previous one, and you shall know them by their cones alone, because really the cones do have it for larch. So in the case of European larch, the overall shape, so if you just ignore the detail and look at the overall silhouette, what we're looking at is an ovoid shape, egg-shaped, essentially, relatively small as well. There's no recurving on the scales whatsoever. They lie completely flat or even actually slightly incurved. The cone scale edges are also entire. There's no notching or toothing there whatsoever. And as earlier, we can't see any of those bracts either. Japanese larch is really quite a different beast. So when you've got good examples, like with so many other difficult groups, if you've got good examples, they're relatively easy to identify. And with Japanese larch, going back to that outline shape as before, really this term subglobose. So it's kind of not quite spherical, really, but it's certainly not egg-shaped. And that's really the key here. The scales are also very, very strongly recurved. So each individual scale tip curves back on itself as the cones ripen. And this gives us this sort of rose or even cabbage-like appearance to the cones. And the other thing to say, I'm just going to skip back a slide, is that Jap larch is much more fecund, I think is the word. So the cones are much more abundant on the branches than you would see with European larch. And that's very evident in the winter if you're looking up into the crown of these trees. The Dunkeld larch sits somewhere between the two, but it's certainly ovoid. It's not subglobose or spherical like the Japanese larch. And if you look at the picture here, you can see the scales are slightly recurved. It's also abundant, so possibly even more abundant than Jap larch. These things will absolutely crowd on the branches of these trees. Now, interestingly, with all of the larches, a lot of the seeds are actually sterile, but they still provide good food sources for birds like siskins, which absolutely love them. And now this character is variable. You will see degrees of recurving on these cones, but this is still the key character you need to be looking for. Here they are side by side. So European larch, Larix decidua on the far left with its nice imbricate scales, like the tiles on the roof of a house, no recurving there at all. Nice ovoid shape. Larix camphori on the right, subglobose, spherical for want of a better word, and cabbage or rose-like when viewed from above because of that recurving. And then Larix marshallensii, the Dunkeld larch in the middle there, with a bit of both. But also I should probably say these are quite often larger than either of the two parents, so slightly bigger cones. Going to move on to the shoots. So with the shoots, essentially we're looking at the colour of the new shoots in summer and late summer. It's difficult to see this. Really, winter is the ideal time, but around about the autumn, you can really start to see this showing well as those shoots start to ripen up and form good woody material before winter kicks in. Now, European larch is described as either straw-coloured, blonde, but really ranges from quite a shining white, quite striking, to very, very pale buff, maybe even slightly pinkish. It's also important to say that it's not glaucous, so it has no waxy sheen on it at all. And it's glabrous, so completely hairless, European larch. And I'll just reiterate, this is when you see really good examples of this. Winter is by far and away the best time to see this. Japanese larch is really quite a different beast. And for my money, the lateral branchials, the new branchlets, are a bit more stout. They've got a bit more meat to them. But they also have this really strong red-brown colour. Now, this is strongest when you've got them up in good sunlight. but it's obvious even quite low down near to the ground. Now, the other thing we've got here is a bit of waxiness, a bit of glaucous coating, and you can see that on the upper part of this shoot. There's quite a pale waxy bloom, as you'd see on black grapes or something, but that doesn't last that long. Really, midwinter onwards, that kind of pretty much disappeared, but this time of year it's ideal. So this really is a good time to get out and look at larches. They're also hairy, and I'm not sure how well this is going to show up on your screens, but we've got these little gingery hairs, which you can see with the naked eye if you get some light behind them, but a ×10 hand lens will show them up quite readily. Yeah, I've got the dreaded plus or minus hairy here because they're not all hairy. Some of them are very hairy, some of them you have a few hairs, but generally if you're seeing hairs, it's not going to be Larix decidua, and if you combine that with the colour, the cone shape, you can easily split them apart. So what about Dunkeld larch? Well, really, it can be absolutely anything in between the two. So it can be quite pale, strawish coloured. This could be described as pale buff in this picture. There are some hairs there as well. So really, stem colours are not especially helpful with Dunkeld larch. And really, this applies to all of the characters that you might see on larches. And I increasingly suspect that there's a lot more hybrid larch out there, which looks very, very like either of the two parents. But really, it's not straight down the middle. It's on a scale between the two parents. So it's variable. There's nothing else I can say about that. And this really starts to be the point at which you have to be very honest when you're recording. So if you've got no cones present, I would say you've got to be very careful about saying it's either of the two species and not the hybrid. And perhaps it's better to say it's Larix spur rather than camphori or decidua. So one final word about stem colour. It's visible in the winter at quite some distance. In fact, you can see this across from one valley way across to the next. And so in the background here, we've got a really good example of Japanese larch with its really quite dark, reddy brown twigs. And in the foreground there is European larch with its straw-coloured, more sort of yellowy twigs, really. And they really do stand out. So if you're out and about this autumn, once the needles have finally come off the trees, go out and have a look-see and see if you can spot some of these and have a stab at their ID from across the way. And then get up a bit closer and have a look. Now, and there's another character here which is not fully reliable, but I'm just going to mention it briefly. The lateral branches here on the Larix decidua in the foreground tend to be much more pendulous than either the hybrid or the Jap larch. That's not hard and fast, it's quick and dirty. But again, you can see that from some distance. So have a look out for that as well. Now, as usual, I've romped through these much more quickly than I anticipated, but I'd just like to say a few quick thanks to my colleagues, Bill Mason, Chris Reynolds, Andy Price, Sarah Green and Glenn Brealey back at Forest Research, but also to Alistair Fraser at Isle of New Boats, Russ Wood Timber and Nature Scott for the very kind use of their images. And yeah, that's me done. So go out and have a look at some larches, please.
Matt, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you. So you've got some great photographs in there. All right, I'm just looking at the questions. We don't have too many, so get typing your questions, everyone. One interesting question from the BPS secretary is, does Phytophthora ramorum affect all three Larix species or taxa equally?
Essentially, yes. If Flora's still on the line, she may give me a different approach, but essentially, yes, all three taxa are affected by Phytophthora ramorum.
And is the policy now just to clear fell those areas that are affected, try and get rid of the infected material?
Yes, it is very much. So this is essentially sanitation felling. So if you're familiar with Wales in particular, but also Western Scotland, when Phytophthora ramorum appears in stands, it'll get served with a statutory notice and they will be felled. So this is to reduce that inoculum load, the spores wafting about in the air, and that decreases the chances of other trees nearby being infected.
A question from me. I'm guessing it's mostly the hybrid larch which is planted. People don't, at least not recently, not planted Larix decidua or the Dunkeld, the Japanese larch. Is that right?
Yeah, that's pretty much right. I mean, Japanese larch is still pretty wildly planted, but decidua definitely not. I mean, the big plus of Jap larch was that it was a bit more tolerant of the wetter climate in the British Isles. It was canker resistant, so it was seen as a good option as opposed to Larix decidua. The hybrid gained popularity because it was plantable in an even wider range of conditions and it grew a lot faster. So if you're a forester, that makes it a surefire bet, and it's one of the only hybrids really which is widely planted in forestry.
Paul asks, do the needles vary in colour between the species? And I think this is a question I asked you in the practice session, wasn't it?
Yeah, you did. So the needles of Japanese larch do have a slightly more glaucous appearance, slightly bluer, in inverted commas, whereas the decidua is much more clear green. I really struggle to see that. That may be my eyes rather than the reality. The hybrid, take your pick, really. It can be anything.
Okay, now here's a great question. Does the hybrid back cross with the parents?
Almost.
I've often wondered if that's the case, because you do get such a huge range of variation within that Dunkeld larch taxon. You get cones that are almost at one end, but not quite, and other trees are almost at the other end, but not quite either.
I think you're absolutely right, Jim. I mean, I had a discussion yesterday with Michael Frankis about this, and he feels very strongly as well that hybrid is much more common in all of its forms. So the original hybridization was probably an accident. It might have been a deliberate attempt, but it was then deliberately crossed for forestry purposes. But out there in the wider environment, there's certainly spontaneous crossing going on left, right, centre. So you get this immense spectrum, and really there are only two surefire ways of telling them apart, and one's DNA and one is oil chemistry. We don't tend to carry little labs around in our pockets, so we are restricted to what we can see, and we have to, the same as with hybrid birches, hybrid oaks, really we're weighing up the characters that we can see and saying, well, it looks most like this, but this is why I would perhaps go back and think sometimes we just have to say it's large.
John Crosley asks, is it important to look at the cones before they age?
Yeah, that's a very good question, John. Ideally, you want them at the end of their first year, because my feeling is certainly the decidua does start to open it up a bit as it gets older, and that can start to make it look like the hybrid. I don't think it ever looks like the Japanese larch, but if you've got cones that age, you'll have cones that are much younger on the tree. So find some of those instead. Now, sometimes you are restricted to what's on the ground underneath the tree, and they will be quite old cones, so they're not going to be in the best condition for this.
Chris Miles asks, is the hybrid fully fertile and seeding itself around?
All of the larches that we see in the UK certainly have relatively low seed viability, but they do all produce viable seed. So yes, the hybrid does seed itself around as much as certainly European and Japanese. And they're very good at it. They're colonizers. Really, they're like demanders. So they evolved to be out there colonizing new ground.
Here's a question from Colin McLeod. Something I wondered about. Is Phytophthora such a problem with larch outside the UK?
I can't give you a direct answer to that. I believe not so much, certainly. But you need to be speaking to a tree pathologist.
Okay. John Faulkner asks, we seem to have a rather analogous situation to bluebells, where the Spanish is popularly used to mean not the native one, and the Japanese larch may be used to mean not European larch. And this then becomes translated into records for Larch camphori.
Yeah,
I just wonder how accurate the records are for the three species.
I would say exactly the same. But what I would say is to anybody who's listening in today or watching this in future, look at those characters of the cones. That really is your guide. And seriously, if you're not sure, it's just larynx. We really want to avoid muddying the waters by saying, well, it doesn't look like European, so I'm going to call it Japanese, or I'm going to call it hybrid. If you're not sure, it's larch. That's the best approach. But yeah, there's already been plenty of new records of larches, so definitely go out and record them.
Okay, on a related question, Michael Phillips asks, if a tree is clearly not European or Japanese, should it be recorded as Larix sp or just a hybrid?
I would say Larix sp.
Yeah.
It's got to be good Larix decidua or good Larix camphori. It's got to tick the boxes. Hybrid really is tricky.
If non-native conifers, this is from David Elston, if non-native conifer trees are to be planted, is larch the least worst option in terms of the associated ground flora?
So there's currently a moratorium on planting larch at all for forestry because of Phytophthora ramorum. So at the moment, larch is off the books, really. There are other deciduous conifers, certainly things like Metasequoia glyptostroboides, the dawn redwood. That is attracting a little bit of interest, but realistically, it's probably not going to produce timber. It's maybe not quite as much a dappled shade giver as larch, but there are other options. Taxodium, if you've got slightly wetter ground, and possibly even things like pseudolarix as well, but none of those others are being seriously considered for forestry at all.
Peter Gordon asks, sorry if I missed it, but did you say something about the leading shoot being sinuous in one species and the hybrid? And does that indicate anything?
I didn't mention it, but that's a very good observation, because I think particularly with hybrid, which grows faster, you do get that sinuous leader. I mean, these things are growing centimeters a week, almost. They really do power on. But yeah, I'm just thinking, I think I've seen it in decidua as well. I'm just trying to remember if I've seen it in Japanese. I'm not sure. So I'll be going out looking, but definitely in hybrid. That's known hybrid. So that's an F1 cross, a deliberate cross.
Yeah. I've often come across hybrids, a dunkeld larch with enormous cones. And I've always sort of put it down to hybrid vigor. Is that? I have no, I have no idea if that's correct, but is that likely to be true?
I've got no other explanation, Jim. So yeah, hybrid vigor is as good as anything. They can be variable. I'm not quite sure why that is, but you can get some real whoppers, certainly. And on the same tree, you'll also get others which are really, quite small, I would say. But yeah, hybrid vigor.
I think we've just got one question left. I need to check chat, but Susan asks, how do you see the difference between a young Japanese cone and an older European one? Is it obvious?
I wouldn't compare apples and oranges. I would be looking for cones the same sort of age. So younger Jap larch cones. So I was originally led to believe that Larch decidua is always red, Larch camphori is always green, and hybrids somewhere in between. I don't believe that's true. So I think you can't go purely on the colour. If you've got cones at that stage in their life cycle, again, look back to the previous year's growth and you'll have cones from that year and compare those.
Okay, great. And I think possibly a final question from me. Is there any difference in, you showed a brilliant photograph of the flower, inverted commas, early on that presentation. Is there any difference between the young cone flower between the three species, three taxa?
Not really. I mean, colours are rough and dirty guide. If it's red, it's more likely to be decidua. If it's green, it's more likely to be Jap. But that doesn't always hold true. Now, whether that's because there is some degree of hybridization out there and they're actually very near either end, I couldn't answer you, but I don't think you can go on that as an ID pointer.
Yeah. Matt, that was great. I really enjoyed it. You showed some brilliant slides. I shall go out tomorrow with renewed enthusiasm to look at larches in the local area, see if we can figure out the difference. To be honest, I've never really looked for hairs on the branches of larches before, so I'll take my hand lens.
Excellent. Cheers, Jim.